Um acabou de parar. A gente vai ter que descer agora.
Over Brazil, on the evening of September 3rd, 1989, a Boeing 737 carrying 54 passengers and crew members just disappeared. The weather was calm. The aircraft was in excellent operational order, and the pilots had been in communication with air traffic control. Although the estimated duration of the journey was less than 45 minutes, the aircraft never arrived at its intended location. Even while there is still much to learn about this tragedy, what little is known about it paints a picture so awful that it is difficult to believe. This is Flight 254 of Varig's narrative. That September 3rd evening, in 1989, a Varig Airlines Boeing 737 carrying 48 people took off from Marabá in northern Brazil. They had just 40 minutes to get north to the city of Belém. Prior to arriving in Marabá a short while ago, the aircraft had taken out from Sao Paulo earlier in the day and made 5 stops. Its last stage of the day would be the flight to Belém, which is located close to the mouth of the Amazon River. The flight's captain, Cesar Augusto Padula Garcés, was 32 years old. Prior to joining Varig in 1982, he had flown for several years with the Brazilian Air Force. Almost 1,000 of his nearly 7,000 flying hours had been on the 737 during his career as a pilot. That evening, 28-year-old First Officer Nilson de Souza Ziel was outside the aircraft performing the walk-around while he prepared the aircraft for departure. Ziel was very new to flying when she joined Varig a little over a year ago. His total experience was just 800 hours, of which half were spent operating the 737. The Boeing 737, 200 they were piloting, was Varig's workhorse domestic fleet aircraft. The specific aircraft being utilized for this flight was 14 years old, and it was safe and dependable. The pilots planned to land at Belém before dusk on this, their final flight of the day. However, they made a critical error as they prepared the cockpit for takeoff. The lives of everyone on board will soon be in jeopardy due to this error and the crew's inability to recognize it. Flight 254 taxied out to the runway and pushed back from the Marabá gate at 5:30 that evening. Many travelers wanted to get to Belém as soon as possible because the Brazilian football team was playing Chile that evening to decide which nation would play in the World Cup of 1990. But soon, they wouldn't be thinking about the result of that match at all. Their brief flight would quickly develop into a last-ditch struggle for survival. Captain Garces aligned the aircraft with the runway and ignited the engine for departure at a little after 5 p.m. As Flight 254 rose to its usual altitude of 29,000 feet, everything was going smoothly in the cockpit. The airplane would only be at that level for a few minutes due to the briefness of the voyage before starting its descent into Belém. First Officer Ziel attempted to locate the plane throughout the climb. Precise location by adjusting his instruments to the radio frequency of Belém's navigational beacon, or VR. However, the needle on his horizontal situation indicator remained stationary when he adjusted the frequency. But this wasn't out of the ordinary. Brazil's aviation infrastructure was, in 1989, rudimentary at best. The beacon might not be functioning or might be unavailable for maintenance. Unfazed, the pilots resumed their ascent. The airplane quickly ascended to its cruising height of 29,000 feet, which is well over the Amazon rainforest. The mistake the pilots committed at the start of the flight was getting worse by the minute, but they were totally unaware of this as their plane raced over the forest. It was soon time to start the descent into Belém. To get clearance to descend, the first officer radioed Belém air traffic control, but he received no response. He made several more attempts, but he got no response. The pilots found this unusual and started to question if there was a problem with their radio apparatus. After trying several times without getting a response, Zile moved from his VHF, very high-frequency radio, to his HF, high-frequency radio, which has a greater range. Indeed, this succeeded. However, he was able to reach an Aeronautical Information Services officer in a different room from the air traffic controller at Belém instead of the controller themselves. It turned out that the controller could not hear the crew's calls on the HF radio, since it only had a VHF radio. Still, this wasn't too horrible. The crew's request to descend was simply relayed by the Information Services officer, and after that, the controller cleared them to 20,000 feet. The pilots could sense something must be wrong by now, but they were unable to piece it together. Their VHF radios were unable to reach the controller, and their navigation radios did not seem to be able to pick up the Belém radio beacon. Did their radios have a malfunction? Strangely enough, though, the crew had no trouble communicating with other planes en route to Belém. The only person they were unable to reach was the controller. The airplane leveled off a little while after reaching its cleared height of 20,000 feet. The airport, or at the very least Belém, ought to have been visible by now, but the pilots were unable to see it. Even though the smoke from the slash and burn agriculture was partially blocking their view of the ground, they should have been able to see the city by now. The performance management system, their crude onboard computer, indicated that they had already traveled farther than the distance from Maribach to Belém. As each minute went by, the likelihood that the crew would be able to see the city ahead of them decreased. Furthermore, lacking radar, air traffic control was unable to steer them in the proper direction. It was the pilots alone. Captain Garces finally concluded that the airport could not be ahead of them when their computer informed them that they had traveled 30 miles more than they had originally intended. He reasoned that because of all the smoke, they had probably overflown it and couldn't have seen it. He turned completely around, intending to approach the airport from the opposite direction. First Officer Zile informed air traffic control that they would be making a turnaround in the interim. Additionally, he asked for permission to drop to 4,000 feet, since this would increase their chances of seeing the airport. This request was approved by air traffic control, and the crew started descending. The pilots looked around them as the jet dropped, searching for any indication of Belém. However, all they could see was the enormous expanse of rainforest that stretched to every direction and the horizon. The passengers in the main cabin were getting restless. By now, they ought to be on the ground. Why was it taking so long? There was an air of anxiety in the flight deck now. Why was it so difficult to locate this airport? Attempting to detect a signal from the Belém radio beacon, the first officer tried an unconventional tactic when his instruments failed to move. He set the radios aboard the plane to a Belém-based commercial station. Guajara Radio was called. He was hoping to determine the direction of the radio signals using the Automatic Direction Finder, ADF, on the plane. The station was carrying a football game, and he could get a weak signal from it, but it wasn't a good navigational assistance. He then gave Radio Liberale, another Bellem-based radio station, a try. The pilots could hear that it was airing a Sunday Mass because of the considerably better signal from this. Additionally, it looked that the automatic direction finder narrowed in on this signal with considerably more certainty. For the crew, things were starting to get better. When the captain noticed a sizable river outside his window, it was yet another encouraging sign. Given Belem's proximity to the Amazon River, the crew reasoned that following it would bring them closer to both Belem and the Amazon. In this part of Brazil, any river that wasn't the Amazon was probably a tributary of it. The ADF needle pointed down the river, giving them double the comfort. As the plane descended to 4,000 feet, the pilot maneuvered the aircraft to the right and started following the river at approximately 6 p.m. After a little while, the aircraft ascended to 4,000 feet. There would be no missing the metropolis from this height. As the river wound its way through the bush, Captain Garces kept following it, waiting for the lights of Belem to appear. The ADF needle continued to point at Radio Liberal's transmitter downstream. Minutes went by, and then some more, but the city was still nowhere to be found. The skipper lost sight of the river in the dark, so he used the onboard weather radar to track its route by pointing it downward. It would have been hilarious if there hadn't been so many people in the back. Here were two licensed pilots attempting to find their way to their destination while flying low over the jungle at night and following a river with their navigational devices tuned to a commercial radio station. Was this the best or worst improvisation you've ever seen? However, the pilots were unable to find any humor in their predicament. Now they were becoming more and more worried. They ought to have noticed Belem by now if they had flown by it and then turned around. Nevertheless, there was still no indication of civilization, and the river seemed to go on forever. As far as the eye could see, everything was completely dark outside the windscreen. In what location were they? For how long might they fly toward the Belem radio station without making it to the city? The pilots had no idea that the radio station they were tuning into was actually Radio Liberal. Instead, hundreds of kilometers south of Belem, on Radio Brazil Central, was another station using the same frequency. Despite the fact that it was officially out of the aircraft's range, so far away that it was either beyond or beneath the horizon, the pilots were nevertheless able to detect its signal due to an unfortunate quirk of physics. It transpired that hundreds of kilometers above Earth's surface, in the ionosphere, an electrically charged layer of the atmosphere, was the source of the radio waves emanating from Radio Brazil Central's transmitter. The airplane then picked them up after they were reflected back down towards the Earth. It appears that Belem was not the destination of the ADF needles that the pilots had been pursuing. They had been pointing toward Barra de Garças, a city located far to the south of where they were the entire time. But this was unknown to the pilots. In the hopes that their ADF needles would guide them to safety, they were holding to them. The idea that they had been hunting a ghost the entire time was just something they were unwilling to consider. The occupants in the cabin understood that something had gone horribly wrong. This was supposed to be a quick flight. Why, more than 1.5 hours after takeoff, were they still in the air? The plane ought to have touched down before dusk. The pilots wasted valuable fuel every minute they were in the air. Additionally, the plane was expending fuel far more quickly than it would have at a high altitude due to the thicker air at 4,000 feet, which requires more force to get through. It was getting tense in the cockpit now. Without radar, air traffic control was unable to assist the pilots. Furthermore, there was no GPS or other sophisticated method of locating them in 1989, with only a few analog navigational equipment to help them pinpoint their location in the dark. The crew was entirely on their own, and at that moment, they were. Time is running out. They needed to locate themselves quickly. In an attempt to identify any indication of where things might have gone wrong, the pilots started going through their flight records. Then, to their surprise, they realized what they had done wrong. It was also really simplistic. They had taken off from Maraba and flown due west rather than due north, which was where Belém located. They had been traveling deep into the Amazon rainforest in the exact opposite direction the entire time. Their error had a startlingly obvious cause. It found out that the captain had been on vacation just prior to this flight. The airline had altered the way the headings on its flight plans were shown during his break. The heading after takeoff was listed as 0270 on the flight plan that the pilots had printed off that evening. This is an absurd heading, because headings can only have 3 digits and can only be as high as 360 degrees. The captain had, of course, taken this to mean a heading of 270 degrees, and at the beginning of the flight, he entered that heading into the horizontal situation indicator. One of the first officer's responsibilities upon returning to the cockpit following the walk-around was to check the flight plan on his own and adjust the navigational equipment as needed. Either he replicated what the captain had entered into his instrument, or he committed the same error as the captain. The two pilots had set their instruments to 270 degrees, or straight west. The sheer volume of numerical data that pilots in aviation deal with on a daily basis, flap settings, altitudes, speeds, fuel loads, radio frequencies, descent rates, stopping distances, visibilities, runway numbers, air pressures, headings, can easily ensnare pilots in a data-driven world and cause them to lose sight of the fundamental reality that they are operating a plane. Both pilots would have realized that traveling westward made no sense if they were meant to be flying north to Belém, if they had used common sense when preparing the aircraft. As a result, they would have realized that the flight documentation called for a heading of 027 degree rather than 270 degree. However, for some reason, neither pilot realized that at takeoff, they had accidentally programmed the plane to fly west rather than north. They also didn't find it strange that they were traveling in the direction of the sun when they ascended to their cruise altitude. When they left, it was evening. The setting sun would have been to their left if they had been heading towards Belém. They had to be flying westward because it was in front of them. However, the crew never considered this. Hours later, as the pilot sat in the dark cockpit, these realizations struck like a ton of careers, possibly their lives. They had missed their way and were now stuck at night in the midst of the Amazon rainforest, running out of gasoline. The air traffic controllers, who were unable to detect the radio beacons, and the radio beacons themselves, all made sense now. The airport that never appeared to be there. They had departed towards the west, well into the Amazon rainforest, beyond the reach of the airport's navigational beacons and Belém air traffic control. And there was still another dire consequence. The river they had been traveling on for the past hour was the Jingu River, which was not a tributary of the Amazon. They had been following a different river than they believed they were for over an hour, wasting fuel at an enormous pace while flying at 4,000 feet. The cockpit was now filled with a sense of foreboding. What message would the pilots convey to the travelers? They had made an almost regrettable, unforgivably simple error that they had been blind to even as the evidence of it grew. Clear evidence in the case of the sun. Now, they were lost for sure, and time was running out. They would run out of gasoline and crash into the thick bush below if they could not rapidly ascertain their whereabouts. Captain Garces instructed the first officer to look through the stacks of documents at the rear of the cockpit for charts of the area in a desperate attempt to find their position. While Zyle went in search of these, the captain started to raise the plane to an altitude of 8,500 feet. There would be two goals for this climb. First, the plane would use less fuel at higher altitudes due to the tinier air, giving the pilots more time. Second, they would have a better view of cities and airports, as well as be able to follow radio beacons from a higher vantage point. However, the first officer could not locate the charts even after combing the cockpit. Subsequently, he and the captain started attempting to locate the radio stations at Maraba, the airport from which they departed, as well as Caracas, another airport they believed to be nearby. The ADF needles came on when they tuned into these frequencies, much to the relief of both pilots. Both aimed in a general southeast direction. The captain informed Balaam Air Traffic Control that they were headed toward Caracas and would be making a landing there. The controller informed them that although the airport had already closed for the evening, he would send someone to meet them at the airfield. It was starting to appear that they might actually build an airport. Still, the pilots had unintentionally committed a deadly mistake. They didn't pay attention to the Morse code, identify that the beacons at Maraba and Caracas transmitted when they tuned their radios to them. It sounded something like this. Had they paid close attention, they would have realized that the signals they were getting came from two other beacons located hundreds of kilometers south, not from these beacons. They were supposedly out of range, just like the signals from the commercial radio stations that came before them, but they were being reflected down to the aircraft by way of the ionosphere, which is located high up in the atmosphere. Now, denial, confirmation bias, and plain old poor luck had finally sealed the pilot's doom. They were tracking the instruments, the only signs indicating they were headed in the right direction, desperately, and they were tracking them more and farther into the rainforest. The minutes passed, and the airport was still nowhere to be seen through the windshield. The fuel level plummeted mile after mile, and still the outside world was pitch black. They were about to make an emergency landing in the bush, so Captain Garces informed air traffic control. Then, using the public address system, he informed the passengers that the aircraft was going to crash land in the rainforest soon because one of his navigational equipment had failed. While some passengers started to pray, others hurried to the galley to start consuming as much alcohol and beer as they could. The last few minutes of the trip were chaos on board. By now, the pilots had come to terms with their situation. They would not be able to choose a landing spot in the dead of night without any means of seeing the earth beneath them. Where they ended up depended solely on luck. The pilots kept a watchful eye on the fuel gauges as they approached zero. And sure enough, the left engine died at 9 that evening. The right engine failed to start as well, less than a minute later. With the exception of a few tiny backup instruments, all of the pilot's instruments ceased functioning when the plane lost electrical power due to its lack of engines. Now reduced to a glider, the aircraft was descending steadily. The 54 passengers and crew would have fewer than 5 minutes to meet their demise in the rainforest from a height of 8,500 feet. The pilots brought the flaps down. They could fly more slowly as a result, lessening the force of impact when they strike the trees. Nevertheless, the majority of the hydraulic pressure that drives the flaps had been lost due to the loss of engine power. As a result, they could only raise the flaps by 10 degrees. They could have stretched the flaps much farther if they had done it while the engines were still running. However, the pilots didn't think to do this in the excitement of the moment. As a result, their speed would have been around 60 kilometers per h higher than it may have been, resulting in a more severe collision. Garces and Zeil attempted to maintain the plane's speed at about 150 knots, which was just above stall speed, as it dropped towards the dark chasm of the rainforest. Their only hope of surviving was to navigate the craft as slowly as possible. They would not be able to descend more quickly as they got closer to the earth, because they would not be able to see the ground beneath them. It would all end in an instant, with no one on board able to predict it, as they traveled at almost 250 kilometers per h. Like a clock returning to zero, the pilots watched helplessly as the altimeter unwound. The plane suddenly crashed into the canopy of the rainforest. Trees tore off its wings, and the fuselage started to tear and buckle. The aircraft's twisted wreckage came to a halt in a matter of seconds. Amazingly, nearly all of the passengers had made it out of the wreckage. The plane had actually slowed down more gradually from the hit with the trees than it would have from a direct impact with the earth. Additionally, there was no explosion or post-impact fire because there was no gasoline on board. Actually, a large number of the passengers managed to flee the downed airplane with relatively minor wounds. After the crash, the pilots also survived. At first, the location of the plane's crash was unknown. The pilots had no idea where they were, and there was no radar for air traffic control. Only 2 days after the collision did it occur. The location of the plane crash was discovered by a group of passengers who were hiking through the bush when they stumbled onto a farm. After all of the survivors were saved, the accident's inquiry got underway. 42 out of the 54 occupants made it out of the crash alive. A total of 12 individuals perished. This is a map showing the expected path of the conflict, and this is the approximate path that it really traveled. The pilots followed the river until their gasoline ran out, at which point they turned around, believing they had overflown Bellam. Why it took the crew so long to realize their first error is still a mystery. There is no concrete proof to support the theory that they were distracted, since they were listening to the World Cup qualification football game on the radio during the trip. Only the last 30 minutes of the flight, when the pilots were already clearly disoriented, were captured on the cockpit voice recorder. Regardless, authorities concluded that the pilots handled the situation poorly after realizing they were adrift. They only ascended to 8,500 feet instead of reaching a higher altitude and attempting to pinpoint their position using a variety of radio signals. They adjusted their navigation radar to a group of beacons whose Morse code identifications they neglected to verify. Additionally, the charts that the first officer had attempted to locate in the cockpit were found by investigators following the incident. If Zeil had been able to locate these charts, he would have discovered that the pilots had enough fuel to reach a nearby airfield. But Zeil never found these charts, for reasons that will never be known. It's important to note that the International Federation of Airline Pilots Associations performed a test a few months after the tragedy in which 21 pilots from major airlines worldwide were provided the flight plan, Flight 254. 15 out of the 21 pilots in this test made precisely the identical error that Zile and Garces had committed on that fatal day. It's unclear if these pilots would have continued to make the same error after realizing it. It is anybody's idea as to why the crew of Flight 254 failed to realize that a westerly course would not get them to Belém. Varig installed more advanced navigation systems in its aircraft after the collision. After being found guilty of negligence, Garces and Zile received 4 years in prison. Instead, they were required to perform community service. Zile maintained his pilot's license, but few airlines were ready to recruit Garces after he lost his. Ultimately, Flight 254's tragic tale serves as a reminder of the value of alertness and even common sense in the cockpit. Fortunately, incidents such as this one are now rare due to better global aviation infrastructure and more sophisticated navigational equipment. However, the lessons learned from Flight 254 are still crucial today. Thank you all for tuning in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss out on our future content. Until next time, stay curious, stay creative, and keep exploring.